Welcome to our third lecture of environmental security. This was the week where we started talking about the connections between climate change and security. This debate started around 2004, in which two different discussions of climate security were initiated. One was an academic focus on the connections between climate and security, and the second was a policy focus on climate security, in which a group of policy professionals began to advocate for taking climate more seriously in security circles. Now, in terms of the academic perspective, this was really an extension of the earlier debate in the 1990s that Thomas Homer Dixon and others had started on the connections between environmental degradation and violence. The field in the early 2000s made a very similar move to look at the connections between climate change and violent conflict, taking proxies for climate change like droughts, temperature change, rainfall anomalies, and the like, and seeing whether and how they were connected to the onset and incidence of violence. So this literature focused mostly on internal conflict within states, starting with civil wars. And civil wars are defined as wars between governments and rebel movements that have a certain number of battle deaths a year or over time, such as 1,000 battle deaths. And some studies lowered the threshold to as few as 25. But this field of climate security in the academic world is, again, looking at proxies for climate change and how they're associated with the onset of new conflicts or the incidence or the ongoing continuation of conflicts. And this new literature of climate security, unlike the literature in the 1990s, took advantage of disaggregated geospatial data sets that could look at the subnational level and look at the correlations in large N statistical data of the proxies for climate change, controlling for some other variables, and seeing whether or not they're correlated with conflict onset or incidence. And again, this wasn't previously possible in the 1990s when the data was much poorer. So this was a new turn. Now, the findings of this community have been mixed. Again, most of these studies have looked at the direct correlations between proxies for climate change and conflict onset or incidence. But these findings, some studies have found strong correlations and others have not. And they're taking proxies for climate change, which are on some level actually representative short-run variability, like extreme weather events or say low rainfall in the previous year, and then seeing whether there's conflict in the subsequent year. That's not quite the same thing as long-running changes in temperature or rainfall patterns. It's really more about short-run variability that might be associated with climate change. Now, these short-run variability may be affected by climate change patterns, but it's a little different than when we think about these changes in long-running over time in weather patterns. Again, as I said, some models found strong correlations and some models did not. Some of the differences in model results has a lot to do with the methodological choices about what other variables you put into the regression analysis and what specific data you're looking at, which conflict data, which proxies for environmental change, what's the time horizon over which they're looking, what geographies in the world you're examining. But ultimately, there are not consistent findings in the literature. So that has led to changes over time to move beyond direct correlations between climate change and violence to looking at indirect pathways by which climate proxies can act on other drivers that in turn may ultimately contribute to conflict. And these indirect drivers include things like agricultural production, economic growth, migration, disasters, and so on. And the field has also started to move beyond looking simply at civil wars to looking at other kinds of conflict, like communal conflict between social groups in society, and looking at other indicators such as protests, riots, and strikes. One of the studies that we read for this week on the academic literature on climate security was by Katherine Mach and colleagues, published in the journal Nature, and it consisted of an expert elicitation of 7 leading scholars in study violence and they were asked what role climate change or climate variability contributed to conflicts over the past 100 years relative to other drivers. And what they found, in their view across 11 scholars, is that climate change and variability was responsible for a small share of conflicts as a contributory factor in between 3 and 20% of conflicts over the past 100 years, which is a much smaller proportion compared to the contribution of low socioeconomic development, which was seen as a contributory factor in more than 40% of conflicts. Intergroup inequality and low state capability and recent history of violent conflict, those three factors each were responsible as a contributory factor in more than 30% of conflicts. So climate change and climate variability were seen as responsible for a small share of as a contributory factor to conflicts over the past 100 years, but they also note that they're most uncertain in their views about the role that climate change variability contributed to those conflicts. So there's a lot of uncertainty in that evaluation. They also assess going forward that there is likely to be an expanded role for climate change to contribute to conflict risk in the future, depending upon different scenarios of warming that they were asked about. They also were assessed to what extent climate change contributed as a causal factor on these other drivers. And in their view, in terms of the leading drivers, climate change had less of a role in shaping those other drivers, though they did note that climate could work on other drivers of violent conflict, such as economic shocks, and could work through low socioeconomic development to shape the potential for conflict risk. So in short, in this admittedly small sample of mostly North American scholars of violence, that climate drivers were seen as a small share as a contributory factor to conflicts over the past 100 years, but may grow in importance over the next half century or more, depending on how much warming emerges. Another piece we read this week was by Nina von Uexkull and Buhaug, who wrote an introduction to a special issue in the Journal of Peace Research, assessing the first decade or so of climate security research. And they noted 7 challenges in the field and assessed to what extent progress had been made. So they identified disaggregation of data, diversity of outcomes, indirect pathways to violence, scope conditions, climate change impacts, climate change response impacts, and methodological diversity. Now, in terms of disaggregation, they noted there had been considerable progress in making use of disaggregated subnational geospatial data that both to disaggregate exposure and climate risk, and also the location of conflict events. In terms of diversity of outcomes, they noted the field started with the study of the contribution of climate risks to civil wars, that is, wars between rebel groups and governments, and then diversified to study conflict risks between social groups, so social conflict between, say, farmers and herders, and has expanded further to look at other kinds of risks, such as riots and strikes. There has been moderate but less development of literature to study the indirect pathways between climate drivers and violent conflict. They noted that most of the literature to date studied the direct correlation between proxies for climate change and conflict onset, as I discussed previously, but there has been some work to look at the indirect pathways that climate works through agricultural production, that works through economic growth, that works through migration, that works through disasters. They also noted some moderate progress on establishing the scope conditions. Under what conditions do climate risks contribute to security outcomes? And here they talk about trying to establish conditions such as agriculturally dependent societies, or countries with high political exclusion, or deviations in rainfall during the growing season. These are the scope conditions that have been started to be sketched in. The fifth issue that they looked at was climate change impacts, and they noted that more limited progress here, that most of the studies to date have looked at relatively short-run changes in terms of climate variability, which may be enhanced by anthropogenic climate change. So, droughts last year and whether or not that contributes to conflict this year, or deviation in normal rainfall or temperature the last couple of years and contribution to violent conflict this year. That's a little bit different than changes in long-run weather patterns, and the field has not done as much to try to study those kinds of connections. Another concern that's emerged is whether responses to climate change themselves could make violent conflict more likely or less likely. So interventions such as environmental peace building may mediate and diminish the risks of violent conflict. That there may also be efforts such as land grabs, or efforts to geoengineer the atmosphere that could contribute to security risks. Those have only been studied a little bit thus far. Finally, they note that there has been moderate progress in the use of more diverse methods to study climate and security risks. There was a lot of this literature was quantitative. They call for more mixed use methods, more case studies, more geographic reach to new areas, and multi-method teams working together, and they've suggested moderate progress to date. The other reading that we read was extracts from my book, States and Nature, the Effects of Climate Change on Security. And here I problematize the notion of what we mean by security and suggest that there are other risks to human well-being that constitute security problems beyond violent conflict. So my book encompasses the contribution of climate change to violence, but it also includes other outcomes such as humanitarian emergencies, and suggests they too rise to the level of security consequences because of the potential for large-scale loss of life. And so that's one difference from much of the other literature on climate security. So my book has a couple of cases of large-scale humanitarian emergencies, including famine risk in Somalia and the risk of severe loss of life after exposure to cyclones. I too review the state of the literature on climate security and make the case that the field needs to move to think about the indirect pathways connecting climate risks and security outcomes, including but not limited to conflict, and that I highlight pathways that we've talked about, like agricultural production, economic development, disasters, and migration. I take up Mark Levy's methodological challenge that he posed in the 1990s of trying to identify paired cases that had similar exposure to climate risk but had very different security outcomes. And the argument of my book in brief is that differences between cases hinge on the combination of three main factors: state capacity, political inclusion, and the role of foreign assistance. So state capacity gets at the ability of states to provide services for their people, and that is to both prepare for climate risk and respond to them, and states vary in their capacity. So weak states that lack capacity to deliver services are likely to have worse outcome, all else being equal. Political inclusion gets at the willingness of states to provide for their citizens' needs, and Some states have exclusive political systems in which not all groups in society have representation in government. And so if they are systematically excluded from government, ignored, or discriminated against, if some groups don't have that representation in government, their needs are unlikely to be met. So in times of climate exposure, they're likely to experience worse outcomes because governments will ignore their needs or actively discriminate against them. So politically inclusive societies are likely to have better outcomes. Politically exclusive societies are likely to have worse outcomes. And this is similar to the notion of democratic systems, which have voting that allows politicians to respond to citizen preferences and have free media. So in democratic systems, we expect that politicians who are subject to voter accountability will respond to their citizens' needs for fear of losing their jobs or for fear of being exposed in the media. The idea of political inclusion, though, notes that some authoritarian regimes can be reasonably inclusive and have representation in government. So they may not be democratic, but they may be reasonably inclusive and have better outcomes. The last dimension that I talk about in the book is on foreign assistance, and some countries block foreign assistance from coming in times of need, and some countries are cut off from patterns of foreign assistance, or if foreign assistance comes in, it gets directed to some groups and not others in an unequal way. And so my expectation is that where foreign assistance is blocked or provided in a one-sided way, we should expect to see worse outcomes. And if it's provided in a way that's relatively egalitarian, we should expect to see better outcomes. The combination of these three factors is the worst outcomes are likely to be seen in countries with weak state capacity, politically exclusive regimes, and where foreign aid is blocked or delivered in a one-sided manner. And some of the cases in my book demonstrate those patterns. Cases that have better outcomes are the ones with stronger state capacity, more political inclusion, and where foreign aid is distributed in a relatively egalitarian way. There are some mixed cases in theory and in my book, but that's really the argument in brief. I lay out some causal pathways between climate risks, which in my book are mostly focused again on short-run variability, like a shock from a drought or from a severe cyclone, and how it passes through societal impacts so that there are impacts on lives and livelihoods. States in turn have their capacity and degree of political inclusion to respond to those risks, and at the same time international assistance can come in to compensate for weak state capacity, and that may or may not lead to security outcomes, which can include humanitarian emergencies or violent conflict. In some of the causal diagrams, there are some additional steps along the way, such as migration or the presence already of armed conflict, which may in turn intersect with some of these other drivers. But that's the argument in brief in my book. The final area we talked about last week was the policy turn to consider the links between climate and security. And in the mid-2000s, the policy community started paying attention to the security consequences of climate change. And that came about through a series of think tank reports, including from the CNA Corporation, whose report we read. And there were other ones from CSIS, CNAS, two think tanks, as well as one by me for the Council on Foreign Relations in 2008. There were follow-on reports, including the 2008 National Intelligence Assessment from the US government, and the climate security consequences began to be incorporated in other official policy documents, including the National Defense Strategy, the National Security Strategy, and other documents, and that extended beyond the United States to other governments and other international efforts. There's the G7 policy document that was written by Adelphi, a German think tank, and that we read an extract from, and there were additional efforts by other governments, reports for them, as well as the UN Security. The CNA Corporation report was notable for a couple of reasons. One, it was consisted of a military advisory board of retired former U.S. military officials who'd served at a very senior level in the Department of Defense, retired generals and admirals. It also made a substantive contribution by coining the idea of threat multiplier. It suggested that climate change isn't a causal driver on its own to security outcomes, but it intersects with other known risk factors. So it combines to magnify other existing threats to contribute to political instability and other outcomes. And it suggested that where climate change intersects with these other risk drivers, it's likely to contribute to political instability, risks of overflowing problems across borders such as migration, and that the U.S. ultimately might be drawn into these unstable situations around the world. There are also specific risks for the U.S. military to military bases and U.S. military forces that are accentuated by climate change that the report talks about. But this threat multiplication is an important one, and it helps insulate this new literature on climate security from being seen as overly deterministic and overemphasizing the environment without acknowledging that other drivers are as, if not more important, but that the environment alongside these other risk factors makes political instability and other outcomes more likely. The report for Adelphi for the G7 in 2015 sought to do something a little different, which was to think about the compound climate security links, thinking about the nexus between climate risks and state fragility. And state fragility gets at this sort of notion of weak state capacity and suggests that climate change is the ultimate threat multiplier. So again, using that same language, and they note 7 climate fragility risks. These include climate change making states more fragile. They also think about the risks of local resource competition at the subnational level, so thinking about farmer-herder violence, for example. They also think about the impacts of climate risks and migration that then can have spillover consequences for other countries. They also think about and identify the risk of extreme weather events and disasters which can cause humanitarian emergencies, or think about magnified effects on conflict and other security outcomes. They're also worried, this piece was written in the wake of the Arab Spring, so they're also interested and concerned about volatile food prices and provision of food, which can contribute to riots and strikes and other political instability that may be accentuated by climate drivers, which drive up those food prices. They also note more concern about interstate conflict risks in a world of climate change in which transboundary management of river resources may become more challenging. Next, they talk about the risks of sea level rise and coastal degradation. So they're worried about more existential risks for low-lying coastal areas, including island nations, but also coastal cities. And then finally, like the Uexkull and Buhaug piece, they're worried about the unintended effects of climate policies, geoengineering, land grabs to find more arable land overseas, or other international efforts to source minerals that may then accentuate or make worse negative security outcomes, or could make them better if there are interventions like environmental peace building that can enhance the ability of countries to prepare for and respond to climate risks. We haven't fully gotten into all of the discussion of this new Climate for Peace report, but we'll pick up next time when we talk more about the policy turn as we transition to thinking about food migration and water risks. So see you next time.